Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 14, Part 2. DCI James found the fretful security guard pacing the corridors of the upper story. He looked tired out. "Good morning, sir," said Brian, on recognising the police officer. James noticed that the security guard had to forcibly stop himself from standing to attention and saluting. It was a textbook example of somebody nervously wrung out and reverting back into old habits for security and solace. "How are you getting along?" Brian asked. "I'm not getting along at all, if truth be told, but for my sake keep that to yourself," said James. Although he'd made the comment out of kindness and in an attempt to build some camaraderie with the man, placing himself in a vulnerable light to ease the blighted guard's ego, James realised that this was, in fact, the bald truth. Such bonhomie that James hoped to establish wasn't really an act of charity, but was a reflection of the blatant fact that they were both in the same boat. James, too, felt utterly helpless whilst havoc was being wreaked under his very nose, and he hadn't a clue about who might be at the heart of it all. A deep respect for this soldier welled up inside James, and he relented. "Let's go and get a brew. I'll ask Theo to be on the alert to relieve you, and I'd like you and me to get our thinking caps on again." "If you think that'll be all right, I could do with a break. I have to admit that these walls are closing in on me, and I feel like I'm going mad trying to think of what I can do to help." James already regretted his impulse to indulge in strong tea, and seeing an opportunity to forego the penance, he suggested a breath of fresh air. "It might blow the cobwebs away," admitted Brian. "You never know. It might blow a few wisps of inspiration into my head too." As they walked together, they discussed the case. "I've gone through all of the security footage for the 2 days previous to each of the tragedies to see if there was anything that could help us there. I haven't missed a second, and I can assure you that I can see nothing to give us a clue. Not a single thing made me stop and wonder," said Brian. James now understood why the guard looked so utterly fatigued. The poor guy probably hadn't slept properly for days, but had watched and re-watched endlessly dull security footage over and again. "The trouble is that I have a very uncomfortable thought growing in my mind," Brian continued. "What's that, Brian? What's troubling you?" "I can vouch for everybody who is on camera, and you don't need to tell me what that means, do you? I see that we're both working from the same song sheet here, Brian. It's unsettling, I know. Nevertheless, you're right." Holding their conversation outside of the museum lent a conspiratorial air to the discussion. Brian continued in a confidential tone. "The awful thing is that it now means that I'm starting to suspect people that I've known and liked for years. If I've got the wrong end of the stick, I'll have wronged some really nice people who have only ever been good to me and are innocent to boot. Of course, they don't know what I'm thinking, but I do. It feels really mucky." "Welcome to my world," said James. "My only offer of consolation is that, if it catches a killer, it's worth it. The tar you've painted and marred your friends with soon washes away. Trust me, it really does. I can just about cope with labelling my friends and colleagues as thieves, but contemplating that they could be murderers makes my mind recoil." "Let's not throw a complete blanket of suspicion then. Let's narrow it down," suggested James. "First of all, let's think about the fire alarms. Somebody had to carefully construct a controlled fire. I seriously doubt it could have been prepared in a rush. It's possible that one of the youths organised it, but I have to admit that it doesn't strike me as their style. I'm not even sure that it's something they're capable of. I know that you say you can vouch for who was shown on the security footage, but think about it logically. Who was seen loitering around the security lodge or approaching it and not leaving for some time without an obvious reason? If there's a valid reason, then we can soon find it out and clear their name. There are certain blind spots, so not every moment is seen in a clear trajectory. a figure can get lost for a time and then reappear on a different camera. It's not much of a gap, but it's fair to say that the security lodge was never a main source of concern. Most of the camera angles would have been based around entrances, exits and the collections. It's inevitable that certain pathways of movement will leave gaps which can't be linked together. Just fire off some of the anomalies as a starting point. Sally can be seen entering the ladies' toilets. Obviously there aren't any cameras in there, but it's a good 10 minutes before she reappears. It looks like she was crying when she went in, so that would explain her delay. And why do you think she was crying? Oh, there's no surprise there. Theo had been particularly testy that afternoon. Despite his charming manner, he was furious when those lads turned up. Sally had defended Scott, saying that he couldn't be to blame. It's likely they'd had a bit of a spat. Theo can be like that sometimes. But they'd made it up later because Theo said he was going to Sally's for dinner that night. James was sure that the museum staff had no idea of how much the security guards could see and infer from what the cameras showed. They probably forgot that the cameras were there at all for the most part. Go on, what other discrepancies have you found? I presume that we're only thinking of the afternoon, otherwise the timing of the fire doesn't work out, does it? I'm not sure of anything right now, so just keep it rolling around and don't worry too much about specifics. If something rings a bell, we'll scrutinise it then. Brian nodded and continued to consider all he'd viewed so many times over the past few days. Of course, that Dutch chap came when the lads were in. When Drew was showing the boys around the archives, Theo had a long chat with him. They wandered off camera for about 5 minutes and then reappeared, still looking engrossed in conversation. I have to admit that they didn't seem too happy with each other, but that could just be Theo's temper after the invasion of the youths. I gather from Drew that the Dutch gent kept missing the opportunity of seeing him in the archives. Theo seemed to be pointing in the direction of the archives at times during the conversation, and I guess the visiting youth figured heavily in the conversation. Excellent. This is the stuff that I need to hear so I can build a picture of what was going on that day. Can you keep going? They'd been walking around the grounds of the museum and had come across a bench pleasantly situated in a grove of shrubbery. Brian took a seat and continued to cast his mind back through the footage he now knew so well. Earlier in the day, about mid-morning, Mr. Jefferson called in with some paperwork for Theo to sign. Because of his business connections, he's helping to oversee some of the building work. He knows and uses the contractors regularly, so he's helping to liaise with them. In fact, it was by his recommendation that this particular building firm got the contract with the museum. They're good too, I'll give them that. I've never known a firm of builders be so tidy in the workplace. What did Jefferson do? He found Theo in his office and, as far as I can tell, asked for some papers to be signed. I'd say that Theo hadn't expected to see Mr. Jefferson, but was pleased nevertheless. The paperwork didn't take many minutes, and Mr. Jefferson soon left Theo in his office. On his way out, he spoke to some of the builders. He's always good with people. He looked around the atrium and the skylight, and the builders seemed to be showing him what progress they were making. He seemed very eager to please, no doubt grateful for the recommendation and the business. Is this sort of stuff helpful? I've no idea at present, but it's usually seemingly inconsequential details that clinch a case. What about at the end of the day? I've looked at the start of the shift, starting from when I took over at 1800 hours. Theo was looking for the day guard, or that's how it seemed. Sometimes he'll chat to us on the changeover. It's usual for him to do a quick tour of the museum before the handover. Theo goes into the security lodge but comes out straight away. He must have seen that the guard wasn't there because he then goes to find him elsewhere. Within a minute or so they're both back on camera chatting away together. All the others had gone home by then, and then Theo left too, presumably to have dinner with Sally. You're an absolute treasure, Brian. You've saved my sergeant hours and hours of trouble. I can't thank you enough, said James. The only thing I think we can do now is to hand over the footage to the techies in our IT department. They won't need to watch it through, but they can put it through some clever software they have. The trouble is we'll have to wait our turn for them to get to it. So thanks to you, I can still keep working and thinking. Once again, thank you for all the trouble you've gone to. Now, do me a favour and have a rest. You can't do this all by yourself, and you look like you're about done in. Brian smiled and shrugged. If willingness and effort were all that was needed, I'd have this licked. I can't begin to imagine how the painting theft was pulled off, and as far as murder goes, I'm stumped. We'll get there one step at a time, don't you worry. If I could ask you for one more favour, I'd be grateful. Just say the word. I feel useless enough as it is, so I'll do anything I can. First of all, if you can gather together all of the discs with the footage from the 2 days in question, and maybe a day before just to be on the safe side. After that, can you give me a basic schematic of where all of the cameras are situated around the gallery? A rough sketch will do, just enough to give me the gist of things. After that, try and switch your brain off a bit and get some rest. The two shook hands. Brian returned to his fevered pacing, and James made for the Manchester Met for his meeting with Monroe. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.